Hello, my name's John Considine. I teach English at the University of Alberta in Canada. This is the third of 3 broadcasts on the subject of syntax, which I'm making primarily for the benefit of my students in English 212, Introduction to the English Language, at the University of Alberta. If you haven't seen the first 2 of those broadcasts, then I'd suggest that you go back and view those before you return to this one. In the first broadcast, I talked about what syntax is. I suggested that it's the arrangement of not so much of words to make sentences, as of constituents, such as phrases, which are meaningful groups of words, or clauses, which are meaningful groups of words which have a verb and a subject in them. In the second broadcast, I went further and talked about the way in which we can start to construct a set of rules which might, in theory, generate all and only the grammatical sentences of English, a set of algorithms for producing all the possible sentences in the English language. We looked at the phrase structure rules, which generates these sentences, or which should generate the grammatical sentences of English. We looked at the phrase structure trees, which diagram the way in which phrase structure rules operate, which diagram the orderly deployment of constituents such as phrases and clauses to build up English sentences. Something that we saw in that broadcast was that there are some English sentences which can't be generated by phrase structure rules in which constituents are nested in an orderly hierarchical way. There are times, the sample sentence was something like, I diagrammed the sentences that the teacher provided. There are times when, in order to account for the shape of an evidently grammatical English sentence, we have to apply transformational rules which move the constituents of a sentence around after they've been put in a basic order by generative phrase structure rules. We ended up reflecting that no transformational generative grammar, as such sets of rules are called, has been produced which really does generate all and only the grammatical sentences of English. Transformational generative grammars have given us immensely powerful insight into how English works, but they don't quite seem to model what we as speakers of English are actually doing when we produce grammatical sentences, whatever those may be. In this broadcast, we're going to think a bit more about the notions of grammaticality and correctness. Those are topics which have been significant in this course for a long time. Right back in the first couple of weeks of the course, when we were thinking about so-called language peeves, we were thinking about usage which some speakers of English regard as undesirable, banishable, incorrect. We were thinking about individual words which are stigmatized by some speakers, words like ap or bromance or irregardless, which different speakers object to for different reasons. At the end of chapter 5 of Curzan and Adams' textbook, a topic that we didn't actually go into in as much detail as we might, is that of people's objections to English usage at a level slightly higher than the individual word. We saw, for instance, in the textbook, if not in class, that there are some speakers who object to the use of hopefully to modify an entire sentence, that it's all very well to say, the little cat looked hopefully up at me when I reached for the tin opener, but we shouldn't, according to some speakers, say, hopefully the snow will stop before I have to go and drive anywhere. We saw other examples of language peeves, of objections to the use of words in particular in constructions. One of these, one that everyone comes across in English classes, is the use of the supposedly plural pronoun they with a singular antecedent, as in if a student wants to see me, they should come in my office hours or by appointment. Some speakers of English feel that this use of they violates one of the fundamental rules about English sentences, that they should be coherent, that pronouns should refer back in number and case to their antecedents, whereas they is supposedly plural and can't refer back to a singular antecedent. That sense of the English sentence as something that has to be coherent is something that we also see at the level of prescriptive statements about syntax. One of the kinds of prescriptive statement about syntax which Curzon and Adams discuss at the end of chapter 6, the end of the chapter on syntax that we've been working through in these 3 broadcasts, is the objection to the so-called dangling modifier, to the sentence element, often at the beginning of a sentence and often containing a participle, which doesn't refer to the subject of the sentence. One of the examples which Curzon and Adams give is clinging to the side of the aquarium, the woman saw the starfish. If we look at the basic main clause there, it's the woman saw the starfish. The subject of the main clause, the subject of the whole sentence, is the woman. The entity who was clinging to the side of the aquarium was the starfish, not the woman. Therefore, many users of English would say, clinging to the side of the aquarium, the woman saw the starfish, is ungrammatical. The modifier, clinging to the side of the aquarium, is dangling. It doesn't hook properly onto the subject of the main clause. The emphasis on sentence coherence, which leads people, including me sometimes, to object to dangling modifiers, is something like the emphasis on sentence coherence, which leads people to object to the use of hopefully as a sentence-modifying adverb. We could ask whether, in practical terms, this emphasis is entirely appropriate. Does anyone really think that the woman was clinging to the side of the aquarium? Are we really convinced by that photograph in Curzon and Adams's textbook that anyone could be misled in that way? And if no one could be misled, why are we worried about this particular use of the modifier clinging to the side of the aquarium? Is this one of those shibboleths which doesn't really have much to do with language as communication, but has more to do with language as good behaviour? It's certainly a shibboleth which is based on the deployment of the constituents of English sentences. It's a shibboleth, if that's what it is, which works at a syntactic level, at a whole sentence level, at the level of moving constituents about and figuring out how those constituents hook together. The other cases which Curzon and Adams discuss at the end of chapter 6 are, I think, a bit surprising, because they're really questions of punctuation rather than questions of syntax at all. When people make so-called sentence fragments, or run-on sentences, or comma splices, what's going on is an unconventional or non-standard or even substandard use of punctuation to mark the relationships of sentence constituents. What's going on, to put it a slightly different way, is that people who regularly speak in sentence fragments, or who speak in run-on sentences, or who put 2 clauses together with a brief pause between them and expect their listener to understand that the 2 clauses are related, are having difficulty in transferring that normal native speaker language behaviour from the spoken word onto the printed page. Does this discussion really have any place in a chapter on syntax? Well, it certainly does lead on to the point that real usage can be considerably messier than syntactic ideals. And this brings us back to the question of grammaticality and to the question of the kind of generative and transformational generative rules which might give us all and only the well-formed sentences of English, all and only the grammatical sentences of English. What constitutes well-formedness? What constitutes grammaticality? Here again we're looking at a big question that we've looked at a number of times in this course. Whose job is it to say what English is right and what English is wrong? We might say that a theory of English syntax, which is unduly fascinated by ideal perfect sentences rather than the messy, fragmentary, confused sentences which real people really produce, isn't getting down to looking at the English language as it's used. It's looking at a kind of idealized construct. It's doing something rather aloof from ordinary language behavior. I think there's a degree of justice in that argument, and I think that indeed it's an argument which has bigger implications for quite a lot of the work that we do in the humanities. We're often trying to strike a balance in the humanities between making big theoretical statements about our object of inquiry, which are in danger of losing sight of the real object of inquiry, and making precise statements about that object grounded in the observation of real data, real human behavior, which are always in danger of becoming simply accumulations of little facts which don't fit into a big picture. We could say that a theory of syntax, which looks almost exclusively at ideals, at so-called language competence, this ideal command of the English language, which we can imagine as underlying our messy performance, a theory of syntax which looks almost exclusively at ideal language competence, is in danger of losing sight of performance. And ordinary human language performance is a topic in which, as humans, we're naturally interested. But we could certainly also say that if we get too hung up on performance, if we get too hung up on counting the number of times that a particular construction appears in a corpus, if we get too hung up on looking at individual quirky realizations of English grammatical rules, then perhaps we are losing sight of the big picture. We're losing sight of the big picture that all those phrase structure rules, all those phrase structure trees which diagram them, do offer to us. I want to pause there. We'll get back to live delivery of this course, which I must say I considerably prefer. Next week, on Tuesday, I'll be back from my conference. We'll be thinking about Curzon and Adams's Chapter 7, thinking about semantics, thinking about one of the last big conceptual questions in the study of English: how do words and how do multi-word units mean things? Thank you.